Ruthless Compassion is a podcast about how you can turn your emotional shit into fertilizer for success and see your darkest moments as opportunities to transform into a powerful kindness warrior. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave a review wherever you listen. Welcome, Ross Ellenhorn, to the Ruthless Compassion podcast.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here. Yeah.
So tell me, why don't you start by introducing yourself to the listener, giving us a little thumbnail of who you are and what you do?
Okay. I guess I've got a sort of interesting position within the field of psychiatric care. My PhD's in sociology, but I'm also trained as a psychotherapist. And I started a program about 20 years ago that's really about really thinking through what it takes to change and how to create the right kind of environment for change for people that are having complex psychiatric events going on, with the belief that a lot of what's going on for them is creating more injury than it's helping. And so, how do we help people actually recover from the injury of the way in which this country treats psychiatric patients? And then, how do we also help them kind of find the right way to also take care of their psychiatric events? So, that's my main business. And then I have a smaller business called CARDEA, which is a psychedelic business. And that has the same themes. The psychedelic movement, as I like to say, there's a horrible anti-psychedelic movement going on in the United States right now, and it's called the psychedelic movement. And it's really super oriented towards medicalizing people, meaning taking their behavior, making everything a problem that can be cured by these psychedelics. And so that carries on that same theme that I'm interested in. And then third, I do a lot of work on play and what play is as far as sort of serious play in sort of a vital and important part of our lives. So those are sort of my areas.
Interesting. So you started out as a sociologist. Do you think that your background in sociology changed the way you approach mental health?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I have this really strange idea that we're social beings, that our connections and our community matter, that our sense of value in the world matters, that a sense of purpose matters, that us mattering matters. And those are not psychological events, those are social events. And I've got this weird idea that most of my life, when I'm sad or upset, isn't because of something psychiatric, it's because of something that happened regarding my connection with somebody. And why are we not affording people who have gone through some of the worst social experiences possible some understanding of what their experience is like? And so, yeah, the sociology is really, and then the department I worked in, its specialty was this thing called medicalization, which is the making everything in our lives a psychiatric event, described through psychiatry.
It's very interesting. I was thinking back, I do what's called independent psychiatric assessments now. And so what that is I talk to people who have some kind of a problem, maybe a workplace issue, they're off work, or maybe they've had an accident and they're having symptoms. So I'm here to see if they have a mental health issue. And when I first started giving a diagnosis with one of the very first companies I worked with, they were very mad at me because I kept diagnosing people with personality problems or with post-traumatic stress disorder. And they said, don't do that. That's too complicated. Just diagnose them with depression or anxiety. And I was thinking, but I can't, because that's not what's wrong with them. So we parted ways. But it's so interesting. And now everybody wants to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder and personality issues. So it's like sometimes it's the right thing to talk about and sometimes it's the wrong thing to talk about. So I'm always very interested in what diagnoses are acceptable at what time and what works at what time. I find it very interesting.
And where's the value in them? What do they get us? If they're not helpful in a person kind of having some sense that they're not alone in their experience, they're helpful. If they give the sense to a person a sort of frame around what's going on for them, they're helpful. They're helpful regarding what medications a person can take. They're not quite helpful regarding what kind of therapies. They're really not. And this country is just filled with these giant assessment centers that's great, but where do you take that afterwards? And mostly what people get is sort of a description of how broken they are. And I'm not sure if that's helpful. So assessment, I'm sure you do very well, and I'm sure you do it with compassion. An assessment can be a really valuable thing. And it can also be a thing that just becomes another definition of brokenness. I think of the DSM as what a profoundly beautiful book that could be if it would be just a group of poems about human suffering, different kinds of human suffering. But what a dangerous thing it is otherwise, making people into things, broken objects that we can kind of decipher and figure out. And what that does to a person's psyche to be thought of in that kind of way. You know?
One of the things that I find with the people I speak to is that usually there's things that have happened to them, like you say, really terrible things that have happened to them that have caused them to be suffering. Things in their childhood or
Hmm.
things more recent, really bad things, often relationship things, people who they trusted, people who they cared about, people who they thought were caring about them, or people who just preyed upon them.
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
find that a lot of what's going on with the people I speak to is that they're suffering because of bad things that have happened to them, not
Hmm.
because they are inherently broken or bad, but because they've had experiences like you talk about that were very traumatic to them.
Yeah, yeah. There's that saying both within the trauma community, which has just become this new diagnosis, this new way of kind of labeling people. It has a traumatizing aspect to it that it's claiming everything's trauma and just sort of everybody sort of described it as one thing. But this concept from the trauma community, but also from the anti-psychiatry movement of it's not what's wrong, it's what happened, is just about right, except for it should be what's happening too. In other words, most people, if they've got some sort of psychiatric thing going on, their biggest concern is that they're odd compared to other people and that something's wrong with them and that they don't meet up to other standards. And we're not giving them enough room to address that, to have a discussion about what's it like to be in treatment and what is that experience like and what does that do to your motivation and your sense of your value in the world and things like that. And so that's sort of what worries me about the mental health system. In a lot of ways, it's a very good system. It does a lot of good things. In a lot of ways, it's part of this larger process that's called normalization, which is like everybody's got to get to normal. I can tell you the most frightening psychiatric disorder. It's almost hard to talk about because it's so terrifying. Normal. Normal would be the worst person to ever meet. It would be terrifying. I would be terrified to meet an ordered personality. I would be terrified to meet somebody who had ordered attachments. It would just be strange. And so we've got all these ideas about how to get back to normal when I don't know what normal means. What and how debilitating that is for people. That they're trying to get to a thing they can't get to, you
Yeah,
know?
perfection.
Yeah, yeah, this kind of thing. It just doesn't exist. That's what makes us beautiful, is what's not normal about us, you know?
Well, I remember definitely in England, there's a tradition of eccentricity. And
Hmm.
even in the
Yeah.
United States and Canada, there have always been eccentric people,
Hmm.
and they're fascinating people. And a lot of famous people tend to be quite eccentric.
Hmm.
But I think that we have tolerance for people who are quote unquote eccentric when they function well within society. But
Hmm.
when they're not functioning well, then the eccentricity becomes a problem. Right? So
Yeah.
we can
Yeah.
we can accept eccentricity as long as the person is quote unquote productive or quote unquote functioning, and we have less tolerance for eccentricity when the person is struggling or behaving in ways that are considered unacceptable.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's exactly right. You just described the social quality of this. That how much is it what a person's dealing with, and when they've been diagnosed with a severe psychiatric event, how much of that is what they're dealing with? Is am I going to be the artistic eccentric or the eccentric that's going to be kicked out? You know, and what does that mean to my sense of motivation and who I am in the world regarding that? You know, there's this remarkable research you may know about by this guy Kipling Williams on ostracism, and he shows people this video of these two cartoons throwing a ball back and forth, and he tells the person they're in another room. These are actually two subjects, and now you can join. And so they part ball three ways. All of a sudden, the two ones only throw the ball back and forth. And the person, the subject of the experiment, they have them in an fMRI machine, and their brain, the part of their brain that responds to pain, lights up. So just that event of these two other beings throwing the ball and not including you put you in a state of pain. Williams now tells people beforehand that's just a computer. There's no other subjects in the room. The same place lights up. That's how sensitive we are to experiences of ostracism. And the fact that we have a system that doesn't appreciate that as part of the overall experience that the person's having is a problem. There's a thing called a chief complaint that you know about, that the thing that the client comes in with. Rarely do they come in, at least in my program, because I don't work with people who, kind of like, I want to work on my depression. That they've been through so much, they're sort of struggling with that stuff. Rarely do they come in and say, I want treatment for my mental illness. They say, my friends got ahead in life. I'm ashamed of where I am. That's what's upsetting me most. And so, why aren't we thinking about that instead of all this stuff about what's wrong with them? How do we fix what's wrong with them? And by the way, if you treat people with that level of dignity and that respect for what's going on for them, they're more likely to engage in treatment. They're more likely to get the help they need. And so it's sort of, you win both ways. People are more willing to kind of talk to their psychiatrist about their medications. They're more willing to engage in therapy. So why aren't we kind of considering that as part or a large part of their experience?
So why do you think we aren't?
Well, there's a couple things. One is power, you know, what an amazing power we have. We get to be the people that say, you're in the outside area, you're in the inside area. If I've marked you as one of the outside abnormal people, my field is the field, if you want, that can get you to be part of the inside crowd, as long as you spend a few years with me. That's profound power. That's the power of a priest. You sin, I can help you with that sin, but you got to come to me for that. We'll get you to on the other side. Then there's a thing in social psychology that's just so profoundly forceful in our lives. And it's called attribution error. Attribution error is, I hear somebody downstairs screaming. I think that must be a crazy person. I walk outside, they're actually being mugged. After the mugging's over and the police have come and I go back into my apartment, I still think they're a crazy person. That our brain is set because it so wants the world to be ordered, that anything that feels like it's out of place, we begin to blame the person, not us, except for one exception, us. If we're having a tough time, we do just the opposite. We say, "Oh, that's the world's affecting me. It's not my thing." And that element, if you're not careful, is always going to be part of mental health care, because there's so much anxiety, there's so many problems, there's so many events going on that are scary in some ways, that you end up in such a tense state that you always go back to attribution error. And so in my program, it's constant tending. It's constantly taking care of the staff and reminding them to not get in that space where you begin to think of the client without thinking about their experience around them, you know?
That's really, really interesting. So,
Mm.
are you trying different kinds of treatment than the conventional treatment for the people that you work with?
Yeah, I mean, we first of all, we do use a few treatments. We think of them more as a way of holding people or interacting with people that match kind of the experience. So, for somebody who's having psychotic experiences, we're more likely to use this thing called open dialogue. I can tell you about that later if you want. It's from Finland. For somebody who's having more experiences of the self, what's called personality disorders, we'll use a thing called mentalizing from the Anna Freud Center. But mostly we're about how do we build this person's sense of faith in themselves. And so 80% of what we do is outreach, and not outreach like we're bringing treatment into the home, but outreach like we're trying our hardest to get this person back to school or work or anything like that. And we don't believe in this idea of readiness, like they're not ready for school yet, so they have to get better first. We believe, let's intensively surround them with the team so they can be ready now, and do whatever we got to do to get them to build their sense of confidence and self-efficacy now, not wait until they're better. We live in a system that says, because I personally believe that the medicine is social inclusion. And we live in a system now that says, well, you can have your medicine after you get well, right? And so, we're trying to kind of get them the medicine now. And that means really intensive psychiatry too, because they're going back to work symptomatically. So with symptoms, it means living with use, with substance abuse. It's called harm reduction, because we believe all these things, if we can get them into their lives, are helping them in their recovery. And why wait, you know?
So, who pays for this though? Like, how is this funded? Because I'm imagining such a team and what's so intensive. Like, who is paying for this?
Yeah, yeah. So we're a private program. So we work with people that can afford us, and we're upper middle class or wealthy people. But this model, this PACT program, it's called PACT, Program for Assertive Community Treatment. is really the embodiment of community mental health. And when I was first trained in it, it was the thing that the National Alliance for Mentally Ill was pushing. And so a lot of community mental health agencies have PAC programs on it, or they're sometimes called ACT programs, or they have a way of doing flexible kinds of treatment around the person. Community mental health in the United States is brilliant. It never got funded well, but it was all about how do we get people included. It was completely about that. It just became medicalized. It became kind of overly, about illness and things like that. But it really had that element about how do we get people back to jobs? How do we support them in their own homes? This concept of the least restrictive environment, that was a big part of it. And so all we did was we took that philosophy and realized that people with wealth actually don't have access to that in a strange way. They either go to a psychiatrist or they go to the hospital. That's changed over the years. 20 years ago, there was nothing out there when we started. So we were sort of inspired by our work in community mental health to move on to this group. But middle class people that can't access community mental health, they don't have anything for the in between the hospital and clinic care.
And where are you located? I forgot to ask you that.
Yeah, sure. We're in Los Angeles, New York, and Boston. We started in Boston. And so we just expanded over the years to these three places.
So somebody who's struggling, who's suffering, and who wants to do something a little different can reach out to your organization.
Yeah, yeah. And if they can't afford us, we will help them find something. And yeah. And so people often come to Boston for our care. People shouldn't go to New York for care. It's really New Yorkers. It's really, we're serving New Yorkers. And LA is a little bit that way too, although some people do come to Los Angeles for our care. Yeah.
Interesting. And what's the role of play in helping people be happier, suffer less?
hmm Well, I actually think that our goal, my goal in life, and I think the thing I want for the people I help is for them to feel more present, authentic, and alive. And by the way, I actually prioritize that over getting rid of symptoms. If I get rid of symptoms, in order to get to feeling more authentic and alive, then I should get rid of the symptoms. But if I had a choice between somebody who heard voices and is married and has a job and enjoys their life and feels alive, to someone who's super medicated, doesn't hear voices, doesn't have a life that they like, doesn't feel alive, I'm going to pick the first one. Same with drinking. Someone's moderating and they got a good life compared to someone who's hell and they're abstinent. Moderating good life's the way I want to go. And for me, play is the thing that generates our sense of aliveness. And a lot of it's based on this guy named D.W. Winnicott, who was a British psychoanalyst. And when a child plays with their toy, they're imbuing that toy with life. They are feeling like that toy is alive. So that's the first seed of compassion. And it's the first seed of the opposite of dehumanization. When you treat a person as a thing, it's because you don't see them as alive. And the child's feeling alive. They're feeling going on being, as how Winnicott would put it. They're feeling alive. And they're also feeling as if their relationship with the person who's looking after them at that moment. While they play, they need somebody kind of there attending to them. That relationship is alive. So all three of those things are happening at that moment. And I think that what children are trying to learn to do, people talk about they play so that they can learn to get along, they play so they can learn to cooperate. I think they play so we can learn to play. I think that play is the thing that brings us to life with a capital L, between me, in the person, and in me. And that every time you feel alive during the day, it's because you're doing something where you're playing. And every time you feel dead, it's because play got cut off. That's how important it is. It's been made into fun. I'm suspicious of why. It's been made into fun. It's been made into thrill. But it's what it is it's when you take something that you feel is outside of you, you don't have control over, and you make something of it that gives you voice. That's serious business.
So what
It's
kind of
serious business.
examples could you give us of play as adults? Because we all know what play for children is, but for an adult, what would play be?
You're at a meeting and you're brainstorming and you're playing with ideas and everybody's excited and engaged. You're making dinner and you're enjoying putting together the recipe, and you know that the thing that's going to be at the end will be your creation. You're taking a walk and you're having thoughts that are new to you, related to something outside of you, some idea or something. And then there's resistance and revolt, that every time that we respond to political oppression, what we're doing is we're saying there's actually some chance I can actually make something out of this thing that feels like it's overwhelming. And so it's everywhere. And playlessness is too. I can't get anything done. I'm disempowered. I don't have voice. And it's at those points where we feel dead inside. And so to me, it's like, it's hard to talk about because every time I talk about it, every time I do a workshop on it, people think they're coming for fun. And it's like, we're going to have fun today, but that's not really the point. The point is that this is the most meaningful thing we do. It's about being in a state of dialogue with the world.
To me, creative problem solving is a wonderful form of play.
Yeah, yeah,
I love that.
absolutely. Yeah, we're really in danger of losing the capacity to play and to be in these states. And we've got to kind of work to keep it in front of us, you know?
And now, let's pause for a quick word about my other podcast. Since I was a kid, I've loved watching movies. As a psychiatrist, I'm blown away by how film touches us at our core, deepens our self-knowledge, and can improve the human condition. I wanted to let listeners know that I've started a new podcast called Real Mental with Dr. Marcia Sirota. I'm going to be talking with directors, writers, actors, and critics to help people figure out their lives by getting to the truth about mental health on the big and small screen. Some recent films covered are Anora, Emilia Perez, Will and Harper, and The Last Showgirl. Please subscribe to Real Mental on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. What do you think of social media in terms of our capacity for play and, and how it's highly stimulating and fun, but not necessarily helping us learn how to play or continue to play?
Yeah, I mean, there are parts of it that are playful. You know, there's something really playful and exciting about witnessing the kind of profoundly, remarkably innovative things people do to create things. So if you're watching TikTok, you're often watching, what? That person made a cake out of that? You know, that person did, painted this thing and it became this. All those moments are an appreciation of play. And so there are elements of it that actually are exposing us again to what kind of profoundly beautiful creatures we are, which is what we need. We need to remind ourselves that we're not just horrible, you know? And so that element during COVID, I think that, when everybody was making, everybody was talking about Tiger King and everybody was making sourdough bread, all of that was kind of play, So there are people banging pots and pans for the nurses and doctors in New York City in the evening, play. Well, that wasn't social media. But anyways, and then there's bad elements. There's the way in which we thingify people consistently on the internet. And we ostracize people, and it's a profoundly ostracizing environment. It's very dangerous that way, you know.
I want you to say more about thingifying people because I think that's become a kind of an epidemic these days. You want to say
Hmm.
more about that?
Yeah, yeah. I think that it's called dehumanization, and sadly, our protest movements used to be about dehumanization. If you really look at what Martin Luther King was talking about, he was talking about that granularly. What does it mean to be made into a thing? And we live in a century where, you know, that's what our century has been on some level. It's just a century of dehumanization. 1,000 years from now, this century is going to look like this. It'll just be this tiny little moment, and it'll be a moment where it began with the horrors of World War I, World War II, and then all the horrors in between, the atomic bomb. Now the crap that's going on now with all the authoritarianism and totalitarianism and the complete dehumanization of people, that's picking people off the street and sending them to El Salvadorian prisons. It's just a period of making people into things. And every time you do that, you die a little too. You become more of a thing. And this is something that people used to worry about. It's unbelievable. 1950s, people were worried about dehumanization. They were talking about it all the time. They were talking about that and this crazy idea they talked about called conformity. They were worried about conformity. This is before GAP, Banana Republic. I can just go through it before any of these things were there. And they were terrified of a world where we're becoming conformists. And conformity is kind of the other side of dehumanization. It's the loss of your inner self. You're dehumanizing yourself. You're becoming a product. I can't imagine what they would have thought about the idea of people talking about a personal brand. I'm a brand. It's like stunning. So that's what I mean in it. It happens in all kinds of cultures. It's happened throughout history, but it's definitely also produced by capitalism. You know, just you're a cog in the machine. You need to get back to work, and I'm only going to sell you so many products, so I better get you to be kind of conformed to this thing. And you begin to treat yourself like a machine and others like a machine. So there's a very important thinker by the name of Eric Fromm that used to talk, yes, a psychoanalyst, sociologist turned psychoanalyst, who talked about this a lot in the 50s and 60s, but so did everybody. So did, I mean, King was a profound representation of that. And the book I wrote about Harold and the Purple Crayon is about that. That book came out in 1955. 1955 was the year that Disneyland opened, the year that McDonald's started, the year that they started putting Coke in cans so it all was the same for everybody. All these things were happening. Mickey Mouse Club, basically this white version of adolescence. All of that was happening in 1955. And at the same time, the Montgomery bus boycott started. The thing that catapulted Martin Luther King into fame. Miles Davis put together the Miles Davis Quintet. The list goes on and on. There are remarkable things people were doing in response to this too. And this idea of kind of how do we keep playing in the face of this movement towards everything becoming the same, you know? King talked about the sacredness of human personality. That's it right there. That's what's sacred. And when you begin to treat people as if they're things like categories, it's a sacrilege against that sacredness, you know?
Yeah, and I can't agree more.
Hmm.
I wanted to change topic a little bit. I mean, it's
Hmm.
not really because it's all the
Hmm.
same thing, but I
Hmm.
wanted to talk to you about change because you've also written on how people change. And I wanted to pick your brain a little bit about your thoughts on change because there's lots of different theories about how to get people to change, but I'm interested to hear what you have to say about it.
Hmm. Yeah. So let me tell you one thing really quick about
Mhm,
how our system's set up right now for sort of psychiatric care. Just to sort of tell a story over that story, and then I'll get to the book.
mhm,
We basically have a system that says as long as you can get the person to treatment, the treatments are ready for them. The reality is people have to be in a space where they're ready to change. So we're setting up these systems where people are failing constantly because they're not ready for the moment where the thing is being offered to them.
mhm,
Right? So all you need is this kind of treatment for borderline personality disorder. Well, but if the person's not in a place where they're ready for it. So much of our change has to do with am I ready to take in help and accept help? Matter of fact, most treatment is actually about that, the conversation of will you accept my help? You could even say a person's done once they're willing to accept help. Like you don't need all the techniques at that point. Well, the same is true in the self-help world. 5 ways to fix this. Da 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 da. The 10 da 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 da. All these 5 steps things. Those are great if you're ready for it. And if you're ready for it, you don't need them because you're probably going to make the right decisions to change. So my interest is in not change, but why stay the same? I think that's more interesting. What are the things we do because we're afraid of change to sort of stay in one place because change is scary? And how do we understand that? And understand it in a forgiving way, not in a way where we're saying you're bad if you don't change. So it does have to do with this sort of pressure in our society that everybody's feeling bad about the fact that they're not changing. And how do we kind of release that? And it comes from this research I've done on this thing called fear of hope that I've developed. And we now have an instrument for fear of hope. And it's basically that hope isn't optimism. Hope is the mindset that walks you through uncertainty to something you yearn for. Hope is scary because once you start walking towards that thing becomes more important to you. And when you don't get it, you feel helpless. And helplessness is probably our scariest experience. And so people who've had that over and over again, they don't they don't want to hope. They're terrified of it because hope was the thing that tricked them last time towards disappointment. And our fear of hope scale sort of shows that because the interesting thing is that the people that are having the toughest time in all our subjects are people that actually rate very high on hope, but also high on fear of hope. So they're like a person who's afraid of height on the edge of a cliff. You start talking to that person as if it's logical for them to jump and they're going to resist you. We call that resistance and denial, treatment resistance. And what they're doing is they're saying, I'm not ready for that. That's scary to hope. You're asking me to hope. And the remarkable thing is, what are they protecting when they stay the same? They're protecting hope. They're saying, I don't want this bit that I still have in me to get hurt. So they're doing something kind of graceful and beautiful by staying the same. They're not doing something bad. They're trying to hold on to whatever hope they've got without it getting hurt. And that's kind of you can't be motivated without hope. If hope is the thing that draws you to uncertainty, all motivation is about facing uncertainty. So if you're afraid of it, you're going to stay the same. And so how do you then develop a sense that you can actually withstand the fear of hope and move forward? That's kind of the idea behind the book.
That's so interesting. So, have you thought, I'm sure you have, like, have you thought of other reasons why people are resistant to change? Like, for example, they are afraid to face that they might not be perfect, right? Because if they have to change, that means that they're not okay, they're not good enough, right? I've encountered that in my practice as a psychotherapist, that a lot of times people didn't want to change because then they'd have to face something that they didn't like about themselves. And so what we worked on was self-compassion and just self-acceptance and saying like it's okay to be how you are, but would you like to try something else?
Yeah. So that kind of fits in with I got these 10 reasons not to change, and that kind of fits in with that. It's like, part of it is how do I kind of assess myself? You have to assess yourself to change. And if you don't have a lot of sense of faith in yourself, you're not going to be willing to do it, you know? And so I was going to call the book Don't Go Changing, but the publisher wouldn't let me. But that was kind of the idea behind it. It's like, it's okay, like it makes sense, Yeah, yeah. And that part of that perfectionism is sort of part of this too, I think. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, because if we don't have enough self-compassion, then we don't have a lot of tolerance for our imperfection.
Yeah. But it's hard to develop self-compassion without some sense of pride and some sense of being effective in the world. And so, to me, those are the things you have to kind of generate. How can I feel like I can control my life? And then the next step is how can I develop greater compassion for myself? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
You were talking a while ago about some of the techniques that you use to help people with, and I was very interested in them. Could you share a little bit more? You were talking about like something from, was it Finland?
Hmm.
And then another technique. Could you want to share a little bit more about those?
Sure. Yeah. So I like this concept of holding, which is like, how do I create the right environment for a person to change? And I like that better than technique because especially in my program, since we don't do a lot of office-based stuff, like how do I think about my interaction with every person, no matter what I'm doing with them, that kind of matches what they may need. And so I think that people that are having psychotic experiences are often also having an experience where they're very sensitive to people owning who they are, more so than other people on some level. And there's some theories about that psychotic experience might actually be generated by this terror of how do people see me and how do they make me into something. And so we use this model from Finland called open dialogue, which is this way of having conversations with people who have psychotic experiences that really tries not to formulate, only reflect. So you would never say to them, "This is what I think is going on for you," or "Here's how I see it," or even use a word they wouldn't use. But you say things like, "This is what's going on in my head right now. This is what I'm experiencing and what you're saying," and you try to lower the hierarchy in your relationship with them, and you try to have this kind of jazz-like dialogue with them. It's called dialogic work. And what that does is it does a couple things. It seems to make them feel connected. And psychosis could be called kind of a problem of estrangement. And it also makes them feel calmer. And from there, you can have conversations about what they want in life and sort of develop things from there. It's a beautiful model. Psychosis is probably there's some maybe genetic reasons for it, but we know that it's triggered by stress and isolation. And in our country, if you have a psychotic experience, the first person you meet is typically a police officer. Then you're tied down to a stretcher, probably in an ER for 24 hours. And then you're made a stranger on a psychiatric unit, all while you're being psychotic. and then people are telling you you have to take these meds. It's pro psychosis, you know? Yeah. So that's open dialogue. And then mentalization is another model that we like more than some of the other models for borderline experiences. And it's the idea that this amazing thing humans do, that to get along with you, I need to be able to imagine what's happening in your head. It's not empathy only, your intentions, how you're formulating things, and all of that. And most remarkably, I need to be able to mentalize how you're mentalizing me. That is so complex. That is probably why we have this giant neocortex, because we are the animal that there are animals that invent and there are animals that collaborate, but we're the animal that collaborates to invent. So we have to be always thinking about what that other person's thinking and thinking about us and thinking about our idea. And when you can't do that, that's kind of what we mean by borderline experience. I can't quite imagine what's happening in this person's head.
Mhm.
And that is what's happening in infancy. That's what you're learning to do in infancy. That's what you're learning in attachment relationships is I'm held in this person's mind. So I'm minding the mind that minds me, you know? And so mentalization is about that, how to help people kind of get back to the ability to do that and how to have conversations about it, you know? I love it. And you can do it mobile. You don't have to do it in an office necessarily, at least for us. So it gives us the ability to do it all kinds of places. And it's from the Anna Freud Center. We're trained by the Anna Freud Center. And I think they've got it kind of figured out in some ways. And it's also an adjunct to therapy. It's not the therapy. It's just a way to kind of help our therapies and our interactions, you know?
Very, very interesting.
Yeah.
I had a thought about something you were saying a little earlier about conformity.
Hmm.
And, you were also talking about how important it is for us to feel connected and to
Hmm.
belong. Are we so much more inclined to conform because we mistake it as a way to belong? We think
Yeah.
that the way for us to connect and to belong is to be like everyone else. And if we're
Hmm.
conforming and the same, then we'll have a community, and
Hmm.
I think that's why people join cults, right?
Hmm.
And cult-like organizations because,
Hmm.
they think conformity equals connection or conformity equals belonging or conformity equals, self-esteem. Does that make
Hmm.
sense?
Oh yeah, it does make sense. Yeah, absolutely. And advertising abuses that. If you look at advertising for treatment centers, it's always about a parent who finally can take care of their kid again. It's always about, it's always about kind of going back to some social role. But that's what advertising does. What it's doing is it's taking advantage of this profound break that's called the Enlightenment, which is that we've stopped fully believing in traditions guiding our lives. And they used to hold us, they used to give us a sense that I'm part of something. And we're discovering more and more that this loneliness epidemic is probably related to that. That the loneliness epidemic is actually the injury of a post-tradition world. That's what that event is, because you don't have a place to go. You don't have a place to kind of be. In the meantime, there are these voices out there who have taught us how to do this, but we're not listening to them. And that's John Coltrane, Ella Fitzgerald, the Transcendentalists back in Concord, Massachusetts. I could go on and on. Woody Guthrie. I just go on and on. All these people in our history, in American history, who are teaching us about improvisation, about being an original, and how doing that can actually make you feel connected to people. And jazz is especially good at that. It's about listening, it's about responding, and it's about being in dialogue. And so jazz really was teaching us about that. But something else was teaching us about it that came about didn't come out at exactly the same time, but it kind of became famous at the same time. And that's this remarkable improvisational art form called psychotherapy. Okay. Because that's what it is. That's what it was supposed to be. It wasn't supposed to be, I'm a surgeon with this thing I learned on this weekend workshop, and now I'm fixing your problem. It was, I'm going to get in an improvisational relationship with you. It's not like we're the same role. You're suffering, and I'm trying to help you with that suffering. That's the rules for our improv, but the rest is improv. That also was a gift of the modern era. Teach us about that. And so to me, that's where our hope is how do we learn to be improvisational people with one another? That's very complex. It's very hard to do. And there's another way we could end this loneliness epidemic. And we're actually working on it very hard right now. And it's kind of falling apart, but we're working on it as a culture. And it's simpler, it's easier, and it's called authoritarianism. that if we could all just follow one person, believe that there was some time where this world was once great and we're getting back to it, we're all going to feel like we're a part of something. We'll have to hurt people that don't look like us. We'll have to give up our own sense of our own value for the mob, but we won't be lonely anymore. We'll feel like we're all part of this one big giant thing. And that form of taking care of loneliness and taking care of the destruction of tradition is kind of winning. The improv one isn't, you know?
Scary.
Yeah, it is very scary. Yeah. That's what I mean by we're kind of losing that capacity to play. And even, I give talks on play all the time. And even people that are from my side of the political world will raise their hand and they'll say, Ross, it's great you're talking about play, but how do people play in oppressed communities? How can you talk about this? And I always respond and I say, you know what, you're right, because nothing ever playful came out of East LA or Compton or Bakersfield or the Lower East Side or the Bronx or Brooklyn. It all play came out of suburbia, Simi Valley, California. That's where it came out of. Like it's always been resistance. Take a look at the paint job on a lowrider car. It is profound in what it does. It's profoundly playful and it's an act of resistance. And so even the left is losing its understanding of what it is to resist. It's becoming itself a kind of flattened conformist. The only hippies right now are Trump supporters. They're complete hippies. They're wild. The hats they wear and the things they do and all that. And the left has become this kind of boring group of censorers, instead of recognizing what we once had, which was this idea that you resist through being yourself.
Yeah, in the '60s, they used to have love-ins and sleep-ins and
Yeah,
eat-ins and
yeah,
stoned-ins and whatever, like,
yeah.
they would just, like, play like crazy, and their play was part of their resistance very much.
Yeah, yeah, and even serious events.
Yeah.
How is it that a group of people got together and figured out that if one of them sat in the front of the bus, it would create this massive, I mean, that was all planned, the Rosa
Mhm.
Parks thing. It was completely planned. What an ingenious event, right? But that came out of, you could call it play, but that came out of innovation and brainstorming and thinking and planning. And that sort of thing is kind of missing on some level. It becomes this whole thing about sort of flattening oppression instead of, well, where's the resistance? Where's the place where we push back? You know?
So we need to bring some playfulness to our resistance, to our, fighting back.
Yeah, serious play.
Serious play, but not just seriousness.
Yeah, 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 exactly. Like, and that's hard to talk about because it sounds like what I'm saying is fun or thrill, but I'm not. I'm talking about how do you resist as a person? How do I, as a person, resist this? How do I keep my personhood going?
Yeah. Back in the old days, there was a group called the Merry Pranksters. You
Yes,
would know
yeah,
about them,
yeah,
right? And
yeah,
they were counterculture people, but they called
yeah.
themselves the Merry Pranksters, so they were very much along the same lines, right?
Yeah, yeah, yep. And there's all kinds of examples of that everywhere. And then there's resistance where it's not even political, but it's resistance. Drag is an act of resistance. Sometimes it's political, sometimes it's just resistance. There's just so many stories of this, and it's all about fighting conformity on some level. That doesn't mean that it's the same as direct political resistance, but even direct political resistance needs that push towards what are we fighting for? We're fighting for the sacredness of human personality, each person respected for the unique universe they are. You know, what we're talking about right now is really the thing that kind of draws me towards the critique of my own profession because it's part of the problem. It's part of that flattening. You're a this, you're a that. You need to fix towards this. There's not enough play in it in that way. You know.
Yeah, there was a movie, I can't remember what it was called. It was with Peter O'Toole, and it's a very, very old movie. I saw it on TV a million years ago, and he was playing a man who had mental illness, probably a psychotic disorder, and then he got sent to the hospital, and he got treated, and then he
Yeah.
came out, and he was totally normal, and he became a
Yeah.
sociopathic serial killer.
Yeah.
Took
Yeah.
away all his play,
Yeah.
all his quirkiness, all his eccentricity, and he became, like you said, very ordered thinker, very ordered attachment, very ordered personality,
Yeah.
and he just systematically started killing people. It
Right.
was
Right.
such an interesting kind of, critique on modern psychiatry, and I think it came out in
Yeah.
the '60s. It's just a
Yeah.
I think maybe the ruling class, I'm not sure, but it was very, very, very an interesting film, and I never forgot it. because it was, here's how you can cure someone and then turn them into a serial killer.
Right. That's great. Right. That's great. Yeah. It it's a crazy system full of some compassionate, caring people and people who really want to help. And sometimes do and often do. Sometimes a lot of the stuff that goes on in psychiatry and in mental health programs is actually does help. And I'd hate to think that my way is the only way. There's all kinds of ways. But each person it helps, it's helping because that person's ready to be helped. That I know. And if you're acting as if the technique's the answer, you got it wrong. It's get the person prepared to accept help. That's the art of all this. I give these talks and I start the talk by talking about this psychiatric diagnosis I've been working on for 30 years. And I've spent a lot of time studying these people. And they have this grandiose belief that they can figure other people out. And they actually have these conventions where they all get together and they show each other how they can figure other people out. And they believe that they can spend time with somebody and tell somebody that they got them figured out and that they actually got them more figured out than the person's got themselves figured out. And so they got this delusion of grandeur about themselves. They created this giant book with all the different things that are wrong with people that they talk about together, this group. They're just like this crazy group, right? And I'm kind of right. It's crazy. It's kind of crazy, you know? And then it's kind of beautiful too, and it's good, and people are compassionate and caring. But there is this sort of absurdity to this idea that certainty has its place, but it kind of disrupts recovery. We don't know what's going to happen next with the people we work with, and that's why improvisation is so important. Growth is improvisational. Healing is improvisational. Why would we want to create these sort of structured ways for people to get better instead of follow them and listen like a good jazz player and respond in as attuned a way as possible instead of saying, this is the thing that fixes that problem.
Well, flexibility, right? Is so
Yeah,
important.
yeah,
Open-mindedness and flexibility. Yeah.
yeah. I think those are great words for also what we should want with the people we help. You know, so why aren't we exhibiting that more? Yeah, yeah,
For sure.
yeah.
Well, Ross, it's been so wonderful talking with you, and I want to start winding up. So I'm going to
Okay.
ask you our last three questions, which is where can people find you and your organization if they're interested in connecting to you?
Yeah, so they can find me at the Harris Teeter grocery store across the street from my house. Once or twice a week in South Carolina. No, they could, Ellenhorn.com, CARDEA, and then it's CARDEA.net is the psychedelic program, but Ellenhorn.com is really my main program. And then I've got 3 books out, Parasuicidality and Patienthood, and then How We Changed, and then Purple Crayons. So those are Purple Crayons and How We Changed are still in the bookstores. And what was the other question? Sorry.
And then that was the first one. The
Oh,
second
yeah.
question is, what are you working on these days?
There's a couple things. One is I'm very excited that our research is finally going to be in a journal, which means that if that happens, and it looks like it's going to, it means that our scale is going to be a scale people can use. The Sphere of Hope scale. So that's really exciting. And then I've been doing more consulting to serious places that are working with psychedelics on how to use the right methods that don't idify people or make them into things. And that's my partner and I have been doing that, and that's been really, really fun. And then hanging out with my grandkid. I think that's probably my favorite project right now. Yeah. Yeah.
How old is your grandkid?
So one is 3 and one is 4 months, 5 months, something like that.
Oh,
I'm
so
gonna get in
little.
trouble. I'm gonna get in so much trouble. I don't have them exact, but something like that. Yeah.
Little
Yeah.
ones. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Enjoy.
Yeah.
And the last question, what is your call to action for the listener today?
We all need to protect the vulnerable people that are under attack right now. We may not have enough power to fight this orientation towards conformity and authoritarianism, but we might be able to do things to protect the people that are being hurt, and we should. Maybe that has nothing to do with what we talked about today, but it's my call to action is do what you got to do to protect those people. It's the best we can do right now. Yeah. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much, Ross, for coming on the Ruthless Compassion podcast. It's
Yeah.
really been wonderful talking with you today.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you very much for having me.
This is Dr. Marcia Sirota. Thank you for listening. Please leave a review and your comments wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to sign up for my free newsletter at marciasarotamd.com, where you'll learn about upcoming online events as well. Also, we love getting referrals from our listeners about future podcast guests, so please email us at info@marciasarotamd.com.